What does sovereignty mean if ordinary people cannot see it, use it, or pass its benefits to their children? That question is taking a surprisingly concrete form in the heart of Ouagadougou. There, roughly 655 acres of protected forest stand inside Burkina Faso's capital. Bangr-Weoogo has long been described as a green lung for the city, a place where nature, education, recreation, and urban life meet. Yet, years of environmental pressure, flooding, security concerns, and management difficulties have left this valuable space in need of serious rehabilitation. Now, the government of Burkina Faso is backing an ambitious transformation. The broader project has been presented at roughly 75 billion CFA francs, around $135 million depending on exchange rates. Authorities say the aim is not simply to repair an aging park, but to turn Bangr-Weoogo into a modern destination for families, children, students, tourists, and residents seeking nature inside a growing African capital. That makes this story bigger than trees, fences, or new buildings. It is also about whether public investment can improve daily life while protecting a fragile environmental inheritance for future generations, for generations still to come. Under Ibrahim Traore, Burkina Faso has repeatedly emphasized sovereignty, domestic capacity, and the idea that Burkinabe people must play a greater role in building their own future. Bangr-Weoogo offers a different test of that philosophy, not on a battlefield, not inside a gold mine, but in everyday civilian life. Can sovereignty produce cleaner cities, protected ecosystems, better public spaces, and places where children can learn about their country's natural heritage? That is what we will examine today, including where the money is coming from, what is actually being built, why the 4-month deadline matters, and what could still go wrong. If you believe Africa's future should be judged by measurable results rather than slogans alone, follow this channel as we continue examining the changes reshaping the continent. Because the real question is not whether Burkina Faso can announce an ambitious park. It is whether 655 acres in Ouagadougou can show ordinary citizens what national self-determination looks like when it reaches everyday life. To understand why Bangr-Weoogo matters, we first need to understand what already exists there. This is not an empty piece of land waiting for a new identity. It is one of Ouagadougou's most important natural assets, with a history and ecological value that long predates the current government. The protected forest covers about 265 hectares, or roughly 655 acres. Within this area, the urban park itself extends across approximately 240 hectares. Its location makes it unusual. Instead of sitting far from the population, Bangr-Weoogo lies inside Burkina Faso's capital, surrounded by the pressures of a growing city. For generations, this landscape has carried cultural as well as environmental importance. Historical accounts connect the forest with the Mosi Kingdom, sacred places, wildlife, and traditional practices. In modern Ouagadougou, its role has changed, but its importance has not disappeared. It provides green space, environmental education, recreation, and opportunities for students and researchers. Its international significance is also important. Bangr-Weoogo forms part of a larger 945-hectare wetland complex that includes 3 reservoirs and has been recognized under the Ramsar Convention as a wetland of international importance since 2019. The wider ecosystem supports hundreds of plant species and a remarkable variety of birds, alongside other wildlife. That distinction changes how we should view the new rehabilitation project. Ibrahim Traore is not creating the value of Bangr-Weoogo from nothing, nor did the environmental importance of this forest begin with his government. What his administration has inherited is something more difficult, an existing national asset with international recognition that needs protection, investment, and better management. That also raises the standard by which the project should be judged. New gates and modern facilities may attract attention, but they cannot become the only measure of success. If modernization damages the ecosystem that made Bangr-Weoogo valuable in the first place, the project will have missed its purpose. The real challenge is preservation through transformation, making this historic green space more useful to the public without sacrificing the natural inheritance that Ouagadougou already possesses. That balance will determine whether international ambition strengthens this green lung or simply changes its appearance. If Bangr-Weoogo is so valuable, how did one of Ouagadougou's most important green spaces reach the point where major rehabilitation became necessary? The answer did not begin with Ibrahim Traore. Problems surrounding the park developed over many years, which matters because the current project should not be presented as though one leader suddenly discovered a neglected forest. One major blow came with severe flooding in 2009. Over time, other difficulties became increasingly visible. Authorities identified shortages in personnel responsible for surveillance, security concerns, weaknesses in management arrangements, and rules that needed to be brought into line with the country's forestry framework. Plans to improve the management and rehabilitation of the area were already being discussed years before the current project. Then there is the pressure created by Ouagadougou itself. As the capital expands, Bangr-Weoogo becomes more valuable and more vulnerable at the same time. Rapid urbanization places pressure on land. Solid and liquid waste threaten the surrounding wetland system. Human activities around the area create additional demands on an ecosystem already required to perform several functions at once. This creates a difficult contradiction. A growing African capital needs housing, roads, businesses, and infrastructure. But every expansion also increases the importance of preserving large areas of vegetation capable of providing shade, habitat, environmental education, and relief from dense urban development. So the choice facing Burkina Faso is not simply whether to protect a forest or develop a park. The harder question is how to do both. Closing Bangr-Weoogo away from the public would limit its educational and recreational value. Turning it into an ordinary entertainment complex could threaten the ecosystem that makes the place special. That is why rehabilitation matters. The government has inherited a green asset with existing weaknesses and growing urban pressures. Its responsibility is now to prove that modernization can correct those weaknesses without replacing one problem with another. And that brings us to the enormous figure attached to the transformation. Roughly 75 billion CFA francs. Before deciding whether that number represents ambition or excess, we need to understand exactly what Burkina Faso intends to build with it. 75 billion CFA francs is the number most likely to capture attention. At current exchange rates, that is roughly $135 million. But understanding the project requires separating that headline figure from what is actually happening first. The 75 billion CFA francs represents the estimated cost of the broader Bangr-Weoogo transformation presented by authorities. It should not be confused with the first phase alone. According to the project announcement, that opening phase is valued at approximately 5 billion CFA francs, or about $9 million, depending on exchange rates. So, what should residents expect to see? The first phase includes 2 new entrance gates intended to give the park a more recognizable identity. Authorities also announced a modern multipurpose hall with 750 seats. Around 10 kilometers of fencing are expected to be reconstructed, an important measure for security and management of such a large protected area. Another major component involves the animal facilities. Plans call for improving the menagerie, so animals can be kept under better conditions. More than 20 animals are expected to be housed there, with elephants, lions, and hippopotamuses specifically mentioned in the announcement. These plans create an impressive picture, but impressive construction is not automatically successful development. A 75 billion CFA franc vision deserves scrutiny precisely because the amount is substantial. Burkina Faso faces competing needs in security, education, health, infrastructure, and employment. Every major public investment therefore carries an obligation to demonstrate lasting value. If Bangr-Weoogo becomes safer, protects its ecosystem, attracts visitors, educates children, supports research, and gives families a well-maintained public space, then describing it merely as an expensive park would miss much of its purpose. But the opposite is also true. New gates, fences, animal enclosures, and a large hall cannot justify the investment if maintenance eventually fails or environmental protection weakens. The real test will come after construction crews leave. That is why the next number may ultimately matter more than 75 billion. 4 months. That is the deadline announced for the first phase, turning an ambitious vision into something the public can soon measure for itself. 4 months is an unusually short window for a project carrying this much public attention. But the deadline matters for another reason. It turns political ambition into something ordinary citizens can measure. According to the project announcement, the first phase is expected to be completed within 4 months. Authorities have also delivered a clear warning to the companies involved. If a contractor begins falling seriously behind, the government says it is prepared to terminate the contract and continue with another company. That approach fits a broader emphasis within Burkina Faso on speed, accountability, and what officials increasingly describe as a culture of results. Yet speed alone cannot be the standard. There are 3 possible outcomes worth watching. The first is speed combined with quality. If the gates, fencing, multipurpose hall, and animal facilities are completed on schedule and function properly, the government will have evidence that ambitious deadlines can produce visible results. The second possibility is speed without quality. A fence that deteriorates quickly, facilities that become difficult to maintain, or construction that damages the surrounding ecosystem would turn an impressive deadline into a costly mistake. The third possibility is delay without accountability. If deadlines pass quietly and explanations replace results, the project risks becoming another promise whose political value was greater at the groundbreaking ceremony than afterward. This is why supervision matters as much as construction. Bangr-Weoogo is not an ordinary building site. It is part of an environmentally important urban landscape. Contractors must move quickly, but those responsible for oversight must also ensure that speed does not undermine safety, durability, animal welfare, or ecological protection. For Ibrahim Traore's government, that creates a straightforward test. Officials have spoken repeatedly about discipline, responsibility, and measurable results. Bangr-Weoogo gives the public an opportunity to judge those principles without relying on political speeches. When the 4-month period ends, people in Ouagadougou will not need complicated statistics to form an opinion. They can look at the gates, inspect the facilities, observe the park, and ask a simple question. Was the promise actually delivered, and was it delivered well? The first phase carries another detail that deserves attention. According to the project announcement, roughly 5 billion CFA francs, about $9 million depending on exchange rates, will come from domestic resources. That does not mean Burkina Faso has suddenly become financially independent from the outside world. The country still works with international partners and financial institutions. But financing this opening phase domestically gives the project a political meaning that goes beyond the park itself. Under Ibrahim Traore, the government has repeatedly emphasized endogenous development, national ownership, and greater reliance on resources that Burkina Faso can mobilize itself. The country's development strategy for 2026 through 2030 follows the same direction, combining domestic mobilization with continued international cooperation. Burkina Faso has already demonstrated an ability to raise substantial resources internally. The Patriotic Support Fund, created primarily to support the country's security efforts, has mobilized hundreds of billions of CFA francs over several years. That fund is not financing Bangr-Weoogo, and the two should not be confused. The important connection is the principle behind them, a government seeking greater room to determine where national resources should go. This gives us a more practical definition of sovereignty. Sovereignty does not require Burkina Faso to reject every foreign partner, every international institution, or every outside investment, a country can cooperate with others while still seeking greater control over its priorities. The real question is who makes the decision? Who decides which projects deserve funding? Who determines the conditions of cooperation? And how much capacity does a country possess to act when outside financing is unavailable or comes with conditions it does not accept? Seen from that perspective, the 5 billion CFA francs carries symbolic weight. It is not proof that Burkina Faso can finance everything alone. It is evidence of an attempt to increase national room for action. But money raised at home creates an equally important responsibility. If citizens are helping provide the resources, they have every reason to demand visible results. And Bangr-Weoogo may show whether domestic financing can ultimately become something ordinary families can actually experience. This is where the idea of sovereignty moves away from government offices and enters ordinary life. For most people, national sovereignty can sound distant. It is discussed through military alliances, foreign policy, mining contracts, currencies, and relations with powerful countries. Those issues matter, but families experience their country through something more immediate. They experience the streets they travel, the electricity they receive, the water they drink, and the public places where their children grow up. Bangr-Weoogo can be viewed through that same lens. The wider environmental complex has attracted roughly 25,000 visitors a year and has served purposes ranging from recreation to environmental education, training, and research. A successful rehabilitation could expand those benefits while protecting one of Ouagadougou's most valuable natural spaces. Imagine what that means in practical terms. An older resident could spend time in a protected green environment inside the capital. Parents could bring their children somewhere that combines recreation with learning about wildlife and nature. Students could use the area for education and research. Visitors could encounter a side of Burkina Faso that is defined not by conflict, but by culture, conservation, and public life. None of these things alone transforms a nation, but together, they help answer an important question. What should greater national control ultimately produce? If sovereignty remains only in speeches, ordinary citizens may struggle to feel its value. If greater control over national priorities eventually produces safer public spaces, stronger infrastructure, better environmental protection, reliable services, and opportunities for families, then sovereignty becomes something people can experience. That creates a demanding standard for Ibrahim Traoré and his government. The measure cannot simply be whether the leadership speaks confidently about independence. It must also be whether that political vision improves institutions and produces benefits that survive beyond a single announcement. Bangr-Weoogo therefore represents something modest but revealing. A restored park cannot solve Burkina Faso's security or economic challenges. But if it is protected, maintained, accessible, and useful to citizens for decades, it can demonstrate how a large political idea becomes part of daily life. Ibrahim Traoré's role in this story should be understood carefully. He is not the engineer designing the gates, the worker rebuilding the fence, or the official responsible for feeding animals inside Bangr-Weoogo. His influence operates at a different level. Traoré has repeatedly promoted a political vision centered on sovereignty, domestic capacity, and development, driven more strongly by Burkina Faso itself. He has argued that the well-being of the Burkinabe people must ultimately be built through their own efforts. His government has also placed growing emphasis on visible results rather than policies that remain only on paper. Environmental policy fits into that broader picture. In 2026, Traoré encouraged citizens to plant and care for trees, connecting them with food, shade, ecological balance, and human well-being. National initiatives have also targeted millions of new trees and additional green spaces in urban areas. Bangr-Weoogo therefore fits naturally into this vision, but it also exposes its limits. A president can establish priorities. He can demand faster execution. He can encourage domestic financing and tell government agencies that results matter. But he cannot personally maintain hundreds of hectares of protected land for decades. That responsibility belongs to institutions. Forestry officials must protect the ecosystem, contractors must deliver durable construction, supervisors must identify problems before they become expensive failures, animal facilities must meet appropriate standards, future budgets must provide maintenance after the political attention surrounding the project has faded. This distinction matters because strong leadership and strong institutions are not the same thing. If Bangr-Weoogo succeeds only because Ibrahim Traoré personally pressures officials to complete it, then Burkina Faso has demonstrated political momentum but not necessarily institutional strength. A deeper success would look different. The park would remain clean, secure, protected, financially sustainable, and useful long after the opening ceremonies end. That is the more demanding test of Traoré's vision. Leadership can start transformation, but only functioning institutions can preserve it. And for Burkina Faso, that difference may determine whether Bangr-Weoogo becomes a lasting national asset or simply another ambitious project associated with one political era. The international debate surrounding Burkina Faso requires the same careful distinction we apply to the park itself. There is no reliable evidence that France, the European Union or Western governments oppose the Bangr-Weoogo rehabilitation project specifically. The larger political relationship, however, is deeply contentious. Under Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso has moved further away from France while emphasizing national sovereignty and alternative partnerships. Relations deteriorated dramatically, and in 2026, Burkina Faso announced the rupture of diplomatic relations with France. European institutions have also criticized Traoré's government over restrictions on political activity, civil liberties, media freedom, and the treatment of government critics. International human rights organizations have raised serious allegations concerning abuses connected with Burkina Faso's conflict. Those concerns should not simply be dismissed as Western propaganda because they are politically inconvenient. But the reverse argument also deserves scrutiny. Criticism of Burkina Faso's political system does not automatically prove that its development projects are failures. A successful park would not erase concerns about civil liberties, just as concerns about civil liberties would not prove that a new fence, environmental program, or public investment has failed. Each claim deserves evidence. The economic relationship makes this distinction even clearer. Despite Burkina Faso's confrontation with France and criticism from European institutions, international financial organizations have continued working with the country. The International Monetary Fund has recognized areas of economic resilience while also calling for stronger public investment management, social spending, and institutional effectiveness. That is more complicated than a simple story of Africa against the West. For other African countries, the lesson may be precisely that sovereignty does not require replacing one dependency with isolation. Governments can seek greater national control while cooperating where cooperation serves their interests. Bangr-Weoogo, therefore, should not be turned into an invented confrontation with France. Its stronger political meaning lies elsewhere. If Burkina Faso wants to demonstrate that greater self-determination produces better outcomes, then the most convincing response to outside skepticism will not come from speeches. It will come from projects that work, public money that is accountable, institutions that endure, and citizens who can see the results themselves. In the end, Bangr-Weoogo should be judged by 5 things: whether construction is delivered on time, whether the work lasts, whether the ecosystem is protected, whether ordinary citizens benefit, and whether Burkina Faso can maintain the park long after the cameras leave. Those standards matter far beyond 655 acres in Ouagadougou. Across Africa, governments searching for greater sovereignty face the same fundamental challenge. National control has little meaning if it cannot eventually improve daily life. Domestic financing can strengthen independence, but self-reliance should not mean isolation. International cooperation can remain valuable when African nations retain the ability to determine their own priorities. That lesson reaches beyond Burkina Faso. In Mali under Assimi Goïta and Niger under Abdourahmane Tiani, Debates about sovereignty are also reshaping the political landscape of the Sahel. Across West Africa and within the broader African Union, governments and citizens are asking what a more independent African future should actually look like. The answer cannot rest entirely on confrontation with France or any other foreign power. It must eventually be measured at home. For Ibrahim Traore, that makes Bangr-Weoogo a revealing test. His legacy cannot ultimately be measured by popularity, speeches, or the strength of Pan-African symbolism. It must also be measured by whether institutions under his leadership create public assets that remain useful after the excitement surrounding their construction has disappeared. That is why this park belongs in the wider conversation surrounding African news. If the project succeeds, families should inherit more than impressive gates and new facilities. They should inherit a healthier urban ecosystem, educational opportunities, protected wildlife, and a public space capable of serving future generations. If it fails, the lesson will be equally important. Political will cannot replace sound management. So watch what happens to these 655 acres. If you want to follow how Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and the wider Sahel turn sovereignty into measurable results, follow this channel and stay with this story. Because Africa's future will not be decided by slogans alone. It will be decided by what nations build, protect, maintain, and ultimately leave behind for their people. We sincerely appreciate your time and support. Every video on this channel is carefully researched, thoughtfully written, and meticulously edited by our dedicated team. We don't rely on automated production or shortcuts to create our content. Every story, every visual, and every detail is crafted with genuine care, passion, and a commitment to bringing you meaningful, high-quality videos.